We're really enthusiastic at Prison Professors every time we have an opportunity to present somebody that we consider to be a leader. And today I have the opportunity to introduce you to somebody I'm going to call my new friend. His name is Harold Sosna. We're going to learn his story about personal development and leadership together, because today is actually our first conversation. So Harold, I want to welcome you to the Prison Professors program and just thank you for taking time today to spend time with us.
My pleasure, Michael. Nice to meet you. And I'm looking forward to sharing my story. And hopefully it will be beneficial to somebody out there.
Well, it'll definitely be beneficial because we're communicating with people who are locked in jails and prisons across America, people that need hope and they need a pathway. And so that's what we strive to provide for them. And the way that we do that is we show the relationship between strong critical thinking skills and success. And those people who are in those jails and prisons, they need to be thinking about, what can I do today to sow seeds for the life that I want to build? And so we look for leaders and ask them kind of about their journey. Why don't we start by just letting us know what part of the country are you in?
Right now I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been here since I moved from Canada in 1979.
So you grew up in Canada?
I did, Montreal.
And so is your first language English or French?
It's English.
But you speak French as well?
I do not a word of it. Interestingly enough, Montreal was about 50-50 French and English. And I grew up on the English side of the city. We did learn French in school, but it was classic European French as opposed to the dialect that they speak in Montreal. So I never really had an opportunity to speak it. You would, any conversation between an English-speaking person and a French-speaking person, at least when I was younger, was always conducted in English.
And when you were growing up, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? What kind of childhood and goals did you have while you were growing up?
Well, I was actually born into poverty. Both my parents were survivors of the Holocaust, and both of them emigrated to Canada individually and met in Montreal. They got married, and they ultimately had myself, and I have a younger sister as well. We grew up in what I presume could be called a tenement. We had very little money. My father worked very, very hard, probably in excess of 60 hours a week, but never was able to earn any kind of significant money. So my mother was not able to work. She suffered terribly from PTSD as a result of her experience in the war. She was very young when she was placed in concentration camps and never fully recovered from it. She was absent a good part of my early youth. She was in psychiatric institutions, was constantly under psychiatric care when she was not institutionalized. My dad worked 6 days a week, so he really wasn't available to help raise me. He enlisted the help of a cousin of his by the name of Minnie, who came in and was my actual mother, if you will, for the first 2 or 3 years of my life. My mom eventually was able to function a little better, and then he left. My mom stayed home for much longer stretches, and life became a little more normal, other than, she would have her occasional outbursts and becoming rational, and childhood was very difficult. My parents loved me a great deal, but my mother really, really struggled.
So I'm really sorry to hear about that difficult childhood. I can say that I've learned a great deal about the the people that survived that tragedy of our recent history. When I was going through prison, I was arrested. I was quite young. I was 23 years old, and facing a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So I just didn't know how to navigate it. And one of the ways that I found strength was by listening and learning from people that had gone through that. I remember reading the going to the library in the prison and looking up people that went through struggle. And that was really the first time that I learned about the Holocaust. And I came across, of course, Viktor Frankl's work and realized, wow, that's kind of what I have to do in here, is to find meaning in my life. Even if I'm living in struggle, work to give something back to help somebody else. And that could empower me and help me restore confidence and grow. And you had the experience of really living through that in a firsthand example. How did that, your parents' background, influence your adjustment growing up when you saw the struggles and the challenges they were having? How did that influence your own adjustment?
Well, that's an interesting question. I indicated that I grew up in a tenement in a pretty rough area, and I was one of the very few Jewish people there, and suffered quite a bit of bullying as a result of anti-Semitism on the part of the people that I would go to school with, or my neighbors. My parents thought that, my parents believed very strongly that my opportunity to improve myself, to get out of the ghetto, if you will, that I was living in, was through education. That was something that they believed very, very strongly in. And so they.
Your parents are the ones that influenced you about the importance of education, or somebody else?
No, my parents did.
Did your parents have a high education when they immigrated?
No, my mother was, I believe she was 13 years old when the Nazis invaded Poland, where she lived. So she had been raised in a very assimilated fashion. In fact, did not even really know she was Jewish. And Yiddish is the language that Jews in Europe spoke with each other. My mother's education was in the concentration camps. She actually learned she was Jewish when she was sent to a concentration camp, and learned Yiddish in a concentration camp. So her experience was somewhat unique. She came from a very well-to-do family, and they were highly assimilated in Polish society. But then they went from being Poles to becoming just simply Jews, and punished for that. My mother's the only survivor from her nuclear family. Her parents, her sister, all perished in either the attack in September of 1939, or subsequently in concentration camps. But when my mother went to concentration camp, she was separated from her parents at that point, and never saw anybody in her family again.
And your father, did he also come from a well-to-do assimilated family before he was?
The opposite. My father lived in a tiny little town in the Ukraine, and he was raised in poverty. He had a very they had no means whatsoever,
and yet they both recognize that the pathway from a difficult circumstance to elevate one's life really started with a commitment to education, and they made that impression on you and your sibling.
Absolutely. It was stressed from as long as I can remember. You have to go to school. You have to do well. and school and education is going to be your ticket to getting out of the life you're currently living.
And what did you aspire to do with your education? I know that you must have started in grade school, being a good student, but walk us through the evolution of your academic career.
Yeah, well, after, I was old enough that I didn't want to become a fireman or a policeman any longer. I my aptitude, if I had any, was really in math and sciences, more so than in any of the verbal written areas. So I really thrived on math and science. I was, at least as far as elementary school and high school, I was a really good student and good enough, in fact, to get into the best college in Canada, which was McGill University.
When you say that you excelled in math and science, was that self-directed learning, or did you have mentors or teachers helping you, or did you just read outside of the discipline and educate yourself to become better?
I just had a really strong aptitude for it, and so I was what would be referred to as a quick study these days. No, I mean, whatever I learned in school, and because of the aptitudes I had in the areas of science and math, I was, placed in advanced classes, and quite honestly, I did very well in high school. In Canada, in Montreal, or in Canada, they have a different, somewhat different system as far as evaluating individuals when they graduate from high school. At least they did back when I was a kid. We would all take what we referred to as matriculations, and those would be final exams that everybody in the province would take at the same time on the same day. And we had standardized testing as well, something similar to what the SATs are today. But in addition to that, everybody in the province wrote the same exam the same day, and that's how we were able to be evaluated against our peers all across the province. And so I got perfect scores, 100% in several of those areas: biology, chemistry, algebra, geometry. That was my inclination, and that's what I really enjoyed doing. My favorite course in high school was geometry, just because of the sheer logic that was involved in coming up with the proofs that we were asked to answer.
And did you have to? You said that you had a natural aptitude, but I have to imagine you also had discipline to do the schoolwork when you were home on your own, because you didn't just magically learn how to do it. You had to do the work. Is that right?
Yes and no. Yes, I did the homework assignments I was given, but it came very, very easily to me.
Fortunate, lucky you, because those subjects were very difficult for me, and I would imagine for most of the people that are working through this course. But I think the real takeaway here is you did have the discipline to stay with it and to try to become the best that you could possibly become at these different sciences, and graduated or matriculated with 100% scores in these really important work. How did that influence the studies that you pursued when you did go to McGill?
Well, I majored in human genetics at McGill, so my natural aptitude towards math and science, and it was more science at that point than math. So I entered into a program in human genetics, and my goal at that time was to be involved in medical research. That's what I thought I really wanted to do. If not, but my mother was always pushing me to be, she wanted me to be a doctor, quite honestly. I don't know that she ever got over the disappointment that she was never able to talk about her son, the doctor. But that was, interestingly enough, that was a path that so many of my friends from high school chose for themselves. Many of them were in similar circumstances to me, and many of them became doctors, some became lawyers, some became accountants, but for the most part, just about everybody that I was friends with became a professional.
That's an important takeaway for anybody who's watching this show inside of a jail or a prison. We may be surrounded by people that don't have aptitudes for math or science or professions, but every day that I spent in jail or a prison, and it didn't matter whether I was in a high security penitentiary, a medium security prison, low security prison, minimum security camp, or in some of those transitional jails, I was always in a population of, just call it a minimum of 100 people or 1,000 people. And there was a percentage of those people that were very much like Harold, very, very much, well-educated and distinguished in a career. And this is the type of person that I would have gravitated to and tried to learn from. And I hope that you are learning some lessons through this program and also through the accompanying lesson plan that I hope that your administrator is able to give to you with this video, because each of them are going to have self-directed quizzes that's going to ask, how are you applying these lessons to your life? And you'd mentioned that your mother wanted you to become a medical doctor and you were pursuing a career in genetics. Isn't there a relationship between genetics and medicine? And doesn't that terminate with an MD, or what kind of degree does that culminate with?
I ended up with a Bachelor of Science with a major in human genetics.
Did you continue your education after that?
I'm sorry?
Did you continue your formal education to go to graduate school?
I did not.
So you went right into the workforce after graduating?
I did.
Tell us about your experience through McGill. Were you equally as successful as an undergrad, earning high marks?
Absolutely not. I had a difficult time in college. I don't know. I really can't speak to why I didn't succeed, but somehow I lost my drive. I lost my desire. Part of it may have been as a result of my involvement with recreational drugs, if you will. I was a child of the 70s, and that was part of the culture at the time. And I'm always one that accepts complete responsibility for my actions, but I have to say that I just lost my drive, and it may very well be that part of that was the drug culture I found myself involved in at that time.
In high school, you said that you surrounded yourself with serious students and people that were really self-directed and self-driven. When you were in college, did that change as well when you were pursuing a lifestyle of the 70s culture?
I went to McGill, which is in Montreal as well, and many of the people that I went to high school with ended up at McGill as well. It was more often than not, students in Canada would commute to university. It was very rare that people would leave home. Unlike the experience that most kids in the United States would have. Who would have the opportunity to go to college. Many of them choose to go to a college in a city that they weren't raised in. That really wasn't very typical for Canada. And then especially given the fact that, McGill, which at the time was by far the best school in Canada, I simply commuted as well as many of my friends did. So I knew quite a few people at McGill when I went there.
When you graduated,
those are the people I hung with.
When you graduated from McGill, tell us about your career path, and how long was it after you graduated that you came to the United States?
I worked from a very young age, whether it was my paper route when I was 10 years old, or bagging groceries when I was 14 years old, or working in the laundry of a hospital when I part-time, and summers in high school, and then continued having various different jobs. Some of them were very, very difficult. I lasted one night as a security guard. The idea of patrolling some strange factory out in the boondocks, and my only accompaniment was a dog who looked like he would just as soon devour me as walk with me. That didn't work real well for me. So I didn't do the security guard thing for very long, but I had a job in an Italian pasta manufacturing company where they canned, cooked pastas, raviolis, and spaghetti and meatballs, and anything you can think of in terms of pasta. And the canning process was very arduous and very difficult, and you would have to fill these baskets with the cans that you were going to be sterilizing and lift them into a sterilizer, and they were extremely heavy, and I would scald myself constantly. I had a lot of very hard jobs, but and those all benefited me in the long run because I never lost perspective of where I came from. That was always something that I think kept me grounded through my life, even as I became more successful. I never forgot where I came from.
And you were working through high school and college, but when did you make the decision to come to the United States, and why?
Well, that's an interesting story. 1976, I had already graduated. I was working in a restaurant equipment manufacturing company. It was very difficult at that time to find a job as an English-speaking Quebecer. There had been a shift in what was going on politically in the province, and Quebec was a province that was 10% English and 90% French, yet the 10% English controlled all the wealth in the province. And at one point, there was this just massive social upheaval, and it flipped overnight, where English, which the day before was an advantage, now became an impediment and an obstacle to gaining employment. So it was very hard to use my education to get a job. There were always preferences for French-speaking people, and so not only was I English-speaking, but I wasn't bilingual. If I had any talents as a kid, languages were not them. Like I said, I was really good at math and was horrible at learning languages. So
let me interrupt you and ask you a question there. So you graduated with a degree in genetics, but you weren't able to find a career in that discipline?
I was not.
So you took a job in any job that you could get just to start advancing your life?
Yes.
Was that a job pursuit or a career pursuit when you said that you worked in the restaurant? Was that like a stepping stone just to earn a living and develop experience? Or did you say, well, I might build my career in this industry?
Yeah, no, I had absolutely no desire to build a career in that industry. I just needed money. I needed a job. And that was the only job that I could find. I worked for a short period of time as in a warehouse for an office equipment company. And then the opportunity to make some more money presented itself with this restaurant equipment manufacturing company. So I worked there for a while. So
and that's that. Let me continue just to give that takeaway for people in jail and prison, because they're going to come home, and I'm learning a great lesson here. If I were lying in one of those racks and watching this course, I hear all of these fantasies about you're going to get out of jail and prison and get a phenomenal job and create a great income. But the reality, unfortunately, for many formerly incarcerated people is you're going to be working in a warehouse. You're going to be working in a restaurant. You're going to be working landscaping. You're going to be working painting, because there just aren't that many jobs that are friendly to formerly incarcerated people. We need to learn from leaders like Harold, who not only focused on worked hard in high school to develop extraordinary skills, went to college, got a degree, but then found that same level of ostracism that I think many of us as formerly incarcerated people can expect to feel. So learn this valuable lesson from a man who became successful. He didn't live with a sense of entitlement. Instead, he became self-directed, self-focused, and did whatever it took to advance his career. And now I'm going to ask you to continue, but that's going to be one of the quiz questions. So pay attention if you're watching this for one of our course credits. Continue.
So there I was, 1976, working for this restaurant equipment manufacturing company. I started off just working, as a helper, if you will. This was a company that manufactured primarily restaurant equipment and would make custom stainless steel equipment, whether it was refrigerators or work tables or salad bars or anything that could be made out of stainless steel that you could use in a restaurant, and that people needed specific sizes to fit in spaces. They would come to a company like ours, and we could manufacture a table or a refrigerator or anything to any specific size. So initially, I was just an assistant to someone who was in the production end who might need an extra set of hands. Here, hold this, do that. Eventually, the people that I work for must have seen something in me, and I was promoted from being simply a helper to becoming involved in the production end, the management of the production end. And so they saw I had this aptitude that they perceived me as someone that could do more for the company than just be a helper.
And I would also show another takeaway right there. What we're learning from Harold is his effort to master concepts like geometry and math and so on and so forth. That skill set really translates well into the labor market, because if you know how to put sizes together and shapes together and do calculations, you bring more value to the workforce, particularly in a blue market, in a blue collar type community where a lot of the founders are not going to have the aptitude of somebody that has mastered geometry and algebra and equations. And they say, wow, this guy can bring a lot more value to our company in other areas, and he will advance faster than somebody who doesn't. So if you're in jail or prison and you've worked through a geometry book, don't just or work for a GED, don't just be happy when you get the certificate and you can answer 2 plus 3. Focus on the more advanced calculation problems. And then whether you go into painting or landscaping or construction, you will have more opportunities to grow and advance, just like Harold did. So how long did you stay in that role?
I worked in that company from 76 through 78. But in 76 is when I met the woman that was eventually to become my wife. She and her parents were visiting Montreal, and as it turns out, her dad and my dad were from the same little town in the Ukraine. When the war started in 1939, Stalin and Hitler sort of made a deal to carve up Poland. Ukraine was part of Poland then, so the Soviets came in and took over the Ukraine, and the Nazis came in and took over Western Poland, which is much of what Poland is today. And so my father found himself on the Russian side, and he was forced to go into the Soviet army, which he served in the entire time during World War II. It's not a good place to be a conscripted soldier who was forced into battle, because those were the people that were on the front lines, and the people and the actual Russians were the ones standing behind them with shotguns aimed at their heads. So if they didn't fight, they'd be shot in the back of the head. So that was his experience in the war. But in any event, those two people were raised in the same community. My future father-in-law, if you will, was younger than my dad, so he was too young to be put in the Soviet army. So he ran away and he joined the Polish partisans, and he fought on behalf of the partisans during the Second World War. But the story, the importance is that the important fact is that they were separated in 1939. And it was only through chance that they actually reconnected in Montreal in 1976. Neither of them had kept in touch with each other, knew that, you didn't know that anybody that you knew was still alive. There was no internet in 1976. There was no easy way to try and find people. So anyway, they hooked up in Montreal. They came together. I wasn't living at home any longer, but my dad said, "Here, you got to come and see my friend that I haven't seen since 1939." So I, eventually he guilted me into coming over to meet a group of people I had absolutely no interest in meeting. But I did go over there. I met the father-in-law, my future mother-in-law, and my future wife.
What is your wife's name?
Her name is Faye.
And so you started dating right after that meeting?
No, absolutely not. We met that one time in 1976, and that was it. She left. She left. She was just someone that I had met one afternoon at my parents' house and never gave it another moment's thought until 1978, when I got a call from her indicating that she was back in Montreal. We ended up, she ended up staying the rest of the summer. I was living at my apartment. She stayed at my parents' house actually, and we hung out together and hit it off. And I think, I found the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with.
And how did that bring you to the United States?
Well, she lived in Cincinnati. her family had a business in Cincinnati, and it just so happened that her father who was in the nursing home business, was opening a second location. Now, he and his wife were also Holocaust survivors. So all my kids, it's rather a unique experience that for my kids, they had 4 grandparents who were all Holocaust survivors. So you can just imagine the impact that would have had on how they were raised and how they viewed themselves. So anyway, he was building a brand new facility. He had risked everything in the world that he had to build this second facility, and he needed more people to help him. So he invited me to come join him in launching this new endeavor. So,
in what capacity did he invite you? Just as a helper, or say, I want you to build a career with me?
No, it was just as a helper, another set of eyes that he could trust as the business was opening. I took advantage of that. I moved to Cincinnati. I went to work in this nursing facility. I joined him just prior to the facility's construction having been completed. Given my background, I had certain skills that allowed me to do things like use a drill and use a hammer, and so I was able to help initially with some of the finishings that were involved in the facility. After that, there were any number of jobs that I did. It served as a tremendous source of education for me, because I was the maintenance guy. I was the environmental guy. So I learned how back then you had floors that needed waxing, and I learned how to wax floors. I had spent one summer as a nursing attendant in a hospital, so I even knew how to take care of people. I learned because of my propensity towards math. I became the bookkeeper, if you will, and ran the business office. I was involved in admitting new patients. I had a fantastic opportunity to learn that business from the ground up, and I absolutely fell in love with that business. I'm not sure why I did. I never imagined in my youth that I would grow up going to work in an industry taking care of the sick and the elderly. But I did, and I found it fascinating, and it became, as far as my work was concerned, it became my passion.
There's a lot to learn from that lesson that you just described for us, and that's something that, regardless of what decisions we have made in the past, we can always sow seeds that strengthen us to open new opportunities. I have no doubt that it was because of Harold's strong work ethic and discipline and integrity that his father-in-law invited him to come and take such an important role. But most importantly, what we talk about is the importance of having the right attitude. We can hear that Harold was willing to do anything it took, whether it was mopping a floor, waxing a floor. He didn't come with a sense of entitlement. He would be willing to pick up a hammer or a drill, despite having a university education, despite being the son-in-law of the owner. He would do anything it took, and he looked at it as an opportunity. So if you're in jail and you are figuring out what to do with your life, you can choose if you want to spend your time watching television and keeping up with the Kardashians, or you can choose if you want to take a job that will help you bring more value to your future employer, that's the way that you advance your career. And you said that you developed a passion for this, Harold. Could you tell us a little bit about how that experience you developed over time led to the development of your own career? Because you didn't come in as an owner, you came in as a helper. I'm going to assume that you eventually became an entrepreneur or a businessman of your own.
Yeah. So I started working for my father-in-law in 1979. He was opening this brand new facility, and he had one other facility. So I continued to work with him and another son-in-law. The three of us ran those two facilities. They were very large facilities especially at that time. The original building was a 241 bed nursing facility, and this new building was 258 beds, which are pretty large by anybody's standards, especially today. So there were basically 500 beds, and we took care of a wide variety of people from all walks of life, and I met so many of these people and just became fascinated with them and their stories and their families.
You didn't only meet the patients, though. I've got to imagine taking care of 500 people required a staff of several hundred people that you had to work to train and develop as well. Tell us about how you develop skills on that front of managing human beings and a staff.
I always felt that I had an innate ability to communicate, and recognized early on that being able to effectively communicate was a skill that I possessed. I was able to sit down one-on-one with just about anybody and empathize with them, not necessarily sympathize with if they're in a particular plight, but be able to truly walk in their shoes and understand what made them tick, so that I could work with them for them to be the best person they could be. And that was just a skill that I'm not sure exactly how I acquired it, but I always found it to be probably the most important attribute that I had subsequently when I became an owner of my own buildings and an entrepreneur and person who directed hundreds of people. That was where I saw my talent in terms of managing people, was my ability to quickly understand people and communicate with them in a way that was effective for both of us.
And I got to imagine that means you're communicating with people at every level, whether that person is coming on as a janitor, a short order cook, or a high level of executive. Developing strong communication skills allows you to put everybody at ease and figure out how to reach their highest potential. I've got to assume, and I'm just making an assumption here, that the background of growing up with all of this tragedy around you really may have had a role in helping you identify that we're all human beings and we can all achieve a higher level. We can all grow. And, somebody in prison should be thinking the same way. You're around a lot of volatile personalities. Some people come from poverty. Some people come from wealth, but we're all human beings. And to the extent you could master this ability to integrate with anybody else, more opportunities open. Would you give us that insight of how you did that, Harold, how you went from being a helper to a manager to a trusted secondhand for your father-in-law to going out on your own? What you started in 79, when did you leave and go out on your own?
I worked with him until in 1979, helping run his two facilities. In the early 1980s, I became aware of a couple of opportunities to grow our business. I found a couple of locations, one in Cincinnati, one in Dayton. At that time, and even currently, in order to build a new nursing facility, you had to get state approval. You had to get what was referred to as a certificate of need. In any event, I went to my father-in-law and I said, there's this piece of ground on the west side of Cincinnati. There are schools that are for sale in the Dayton area that could easily be converted to a nursing facility. I said to him, why don't you, if you will, begin to look for another business? And he was a pretty generous guy, and he said, well, you're bringing me this opportunity. You've proven yourself to be a hard worker, smart person. You're somebody I want to build my future with, and I'd like to make you a partner in this endeavor. So I partnered with him and my other brother-in-law in the development of a retirement community in Cincinnati and another one in Dayton. And each of us were 1/3 partners on that endeavor. So I went from being someone who swept floors to being an administrator for my father-in-law's buildings to now being an owner of 2 new retirement communities. That was in the early and mid 80s. And I continued in that role, running the 2 facilities for my father-in-law and working in the 2 new facilities that we had developed. I continued in that role until I went off completely on my own in January of 1998.
And what did you do in January of 1998?
I bought a nursing facility in Dayton. It was a 100-bed nursing. And Dayton is about a 45-minute drive from where I live in Cincinnati.
And you kept your ownership of the other 2 that you were partners in as well?
Yes. So I continued to be involved in those 2 facilities, and then bought this 1 facility in Dayton, and also bought 2 facilities in Columbus. So on January 1st, 1998, I went out on my own and began my company, which ultimately became known as Premier Healthcare Management.
And how many beds under management did Premier develop?
Well, we grew by acquiring facilities that were very much like the facility I acquired in Dayton. To call it a fixer-upper would be to give it far too much credit. It was a terrible facility. It had a horrible reputation. The staff there was no direction for the staff. There was they were short of supplies. They were short of food. Their census was very low. They had very little revenue, and the building was a house that started with a house that was originally constructed in the late 1800s and was added on to piecemeal over the years, a few beds here, a few beds there. It was a disaster as far as trying to operate a facility efficiently, cost effectively, because it wasn't designed to be run that way. It was just someone had an opportunity to add 10 beds here and 25 beds there, and they took advantage of that opportunity and grew this building, and then it had real trouble with it. It became
So you became a savior of properties that were down, but it sounds like you were not only a business executive and a team builder and a process creator, you also became a real estate investor as well. Did you, because you acquired the land and the property as well, and did you build a thriving real estate empire in this through this course?
Well, I owned all the nursing facilities that I bought, and so that was pretty much my foray, if you will, into real estate. I loved what I was doing. I was successful at what I was doing. I had tremendous satisfaction in knowing that I was taking facilities that were run down, people were not being treated well, and my passion was to take these buildings and make my industry do whatever little part I could to make my industry viewed a little bit better than it was being viewed.
So there's an interesting analogy there to a lot of books that people read in jail, such as that one by Kiyosaki, I think it is, about Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that shows about how successful people think. And there's an analogy there about Ray Kroc from McDonald's, who really spoke about the importance of building a business that can support the real estate. And by building a successful business, you can pay the mortgage and acquire more and more real estate. How did your business decisions result in or relate to growing a bigger real estate empire? How many buildings did you eventually acquire?
Eventually, I had 11 buildings, 9 of which I operated and 2 of which I leased out to a third-party independent operator, because at the time I made my decision to lease those out, I was in no position to manage those facilities. They were located in Columbus. They were 90 minutes away, and I needed to be able to visit my buildings each and every day, and taking 3 hours of just travel time out of my day each day to go visit my facilities, it didn't work. My days were pretty full. From the time I joined my father-in-law to I worked 7 days a week. It was 2 years into my working with my father-in-law that I got my first Sunday afternoon off. Other than that, I worked 7 days a week, long hours each day, because that's what we needed. That's what it took to start a business. And, I was blessed with, I presume, quite a bit of energy and a drive that whatever I was passionate about, that translated into my falling in love and needing to make sure that whatever I was involved in blossomed. You have to be passionate, I believe, about what you're doing for it to be effective. It's the same thing when you're trying to manage your people. You have to the extent that you can find people or help people become more passionate about what they're doing, the better off they're going to be, and the better off the company is going to be. Drive and passion are keys to success.
Over the course of your career, how many jobs would you say that you've created?
I grew the business to be almost 1,000 beds, and typically a 100-bed facility, if it was staffed properly, would have somewhere between 125 to 150 employees. Fortunately, ours was an industry that enjoyed a very high turnover rate. So I have to say I employed tens of thousands of people over that span of time.
And this is the reason that we're so grateful to Harold Sosna for coming onto our program. He has taught us a great deal in this lesson about really personal development. And I learned a lot of lessons that you will find in the lesson plan that we create here, but I hope that you do as well. We're listening to a man who created more than 10,000 jobs, who built a real estate empire, who contributed to his community with paying high taxes that went to support schools and law enforcement, and even probably supporting the prisons in the community. So he did a great deal of life starting with nothing. And that gives me hope that I can build something, even though I was in prison for 26 years. And I hope it gives you hope. Harold, when you were, one of the things that really interests me as somebody who always has to be self-made and driving, you've built this career that few of us get an opportunity to listen to leaders like you. When you look back on building a business, helping people achieve their highest potential, and growing a real estate empire, you really had many, many areas there that you had to become a master of many areas. As you look back, what relationship did acquiring, appreciating assets like real estate, improving upon it, how did that contribute to preparing you for a prosperous retirement as opposed to a business? What is the relationship between real estate ownership and business?
My philosophy on business, and I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but my philosophy on business was not necessarily growing the business, but making the business I was involved in the best it could possibly be. So if I owned and operated nursing facilities, it was extremely important to me that we took great care of our customers, if you will. Our customers were our staff, our customers were our patients, and our customers were the people in the hospitals that made referrals to us. I had to, that's where how I saw to better take care of people, and the growing of my business flowed from my passion for making the lives of those people I was taking care of better. I never had this goal, if you will, of wanting to become successful. I became successful as a byproduct of my passion, my desire to do a really good job at whatever I was doing. And fortunately for me, I found a passion. I found something that I really, really cared about. I loved the patients we were taking care of. I loved the staff that I was fortunate enough to be able to work with, because there are some incredibly gifted and dynamic and dedicated people who work in healthcare. It's not the highest paying profession, and it attracts a lot of really good people who are willing to make that sacrifice. So, Michael, I never wanted to become rich. That was never what drove me. What drove me was to be the best I could be at what I was doing, and success followed that. It was a result of that attitude, not necessarily a desire to acquire wealth.
Well, that is excellent guidance for all of us who are striving to be the best that we can be. Regardless of where we are today, we can always start sowing seeds for a more prosperous future, a future where we can live a life of meaning and relevance and dignity and community contribution. And I'm just so grateful to you, Mr. Sosna, for taking a time to share this inspiring message to people who right now are living without hope. I think you've given me a lot of hope. And I'm going to leave the last word with you. If you have any guidance for people who may have to go out into the world and create their own pathway, starting in a manufacturing job and finding a way to get other people to believe in them, do you have any final words of wisdom that you might want to share with those people?
It seems almost inappropriate, if you will, for me to be sitting here today offering that kind of guidance to people. But here's the way I found my success. I loved what I was doing. I worked really, really hard at what I was doing. There was nothing I wasn't willing to do. I never considered any task beneath me. And everybody that I worked with, I valued regardless of the position they were in. And then my management style, I found very early on that my role with the company ultimately became the person with the vision, the person who tried to figure out where we wanted to go and how we needed to go about getting there. And I was fortunate and able to surround myself with people who could take my vision and then translate it into success. And there's a skill involved in making sure that you hire the right people, that you create a team that ultimately helps you move the company in the direction it needs to go, where you want it to go. And the idea is to be an effective leader. I really believe it all comes down to communication and empathy. I can't overemphasize enough how important empathy is. I think people would understand it at, let's say, at the level of athletics, where you look at a coach and he has to motivate a lot of different people on that team. And classically, he would need to understand which one of those players would just simply, if they weren't doing well, needed someone to go and put an arm around them and talk to them, or which people actually needed a kick in the butt in order to get moving. So understanding the people that you work with and what drives them is critical to the success of the company. And I've often said that to my managers, that when you're working with people, the most effective way of getting them to do the best job possible, and that applies to individuals as well as employees, is to impart, to try to create a situation where people end up wanting to do something as opposed to having to do something. Turning something from a have to into a want to is as far as I'm concerned, the recipe for success. And
Final, yeah, I'm gonna say those are some excellent words of wisdom. But always, every time he speaks or he says a sentence, I learn something new. And you may notice that when he started this, I asked him to provide us with a bit of guidance for the last words. But notice how he started. Despite having created 10,000 jobs, he sees himself in just such a humble way of saying, I may not be the person to provide this guidance, but he's the kind of person that's sounds to me like he's always harder on himself than he is on anybody else. He's a person that wants to give credit to everybody else for everything good that happens and take responsibility for anything bad that happens. That is a lesson from a leader, from a master that I certainly learned from, and I hope that you're learning from as well. Live in the world as it exists and figure out how can I make it better. I think that's a final takeaway that I've gotten from you, Mr. Sosna. And again, I just want to thank you so much for sharing this with our audience. We've kind of gone over time here, but I will great lesson that certainly would have taught me through the journey. And I want to thank you for helping us influence hundreds of thousands of people who are living in struggle.
It's my pleasure, Michael. I'm happy to do whatever I can do to help anybody. That's always been what drives me.
Thank you.